All right, in this section, we're going to learn about the conditional. The conditional means if P then Q, and it's represented by this arrow right here. So your P's are the same, true, true, false, false. Your Q's are the same, true, false, true, false. If P then Q, here's the main thing you need to remember. The only time the answer is false is when you start with a true and you end with a false. If you start with a true and it proves true, the answer is true. If you start with a true and it proves to be false, the answer is false. If you start with a false, the answer is still going to be true. So anytime you start with something that's false, whether it turns out to be true or false, since it was false when you started, they say you're telling it's a true. Okay, they have a little example in the book about telling a lie and all that. But just remember, the main thing, when you start with a true and you end with a false, is the only time it's going to be false. Okay. So let's look at this. Given that P, Q, and R are all false, find the truth value of the following statement. Okay, so P's a false. Now, if Q is false, not Q would be true. So we have if false, then true, then not R, if it's false, that's going to be true, then Q was false. Okay, so let's look at this. False, then true. If you start out with a false, it's true. Anytime you start out with a false, with the conditional, it's true. So I'm going to have true. If it's true, then if you start out with a true and it goes to a false, that's the only time you get a false on this truth table. Okay, so our final answer on this one, we do parentheses first. This was true. This one was false. If we start with a true and we end up with a false statement, the final answer on this one would be false, and that's the answer that they would want to see. Okay, let's look at another one. On the example here, different color. All right, so this would be true, then 7 equals 3 is obviously false. So if I start with a true and I end with a false, it is false. That is the only time I get a false. On this one, 8 is less than 2 is false. If it's false, then it's false. Remember, anytime you start with false, final answer is true. Okay. This one, 4 is equal to 3 plus 1. They have not equal, so that's a false statement. False, then true. If you start with a false, the final answer is true. So the answer to part A is false. Part B is true because we started with a false. Part C is true because we started with a false.